Good morning, everybody. Glad to have everybody back after Thanksgiving. I'm Bernie Fisher, and I'm going to moderate today. Our speaker today is James Farmer, who I've known since his PhD program. I served on his PhD committee and been involved with him for a long time, so I'm always interested when James has got a new idea to talk about. James is an assistant professor in the Department of Recreation, Parks, and Tourism Studies in the School of Public Health. You've been here about 3 years, 4 years?
6.
6, oh, been here longer than I thought, okay. And he co-directs the campus farm at Indiana University, as well as has the Human Dimensions Lab. Today he's going to talk about extending the design principles for common pool resource governance to conservation easements on private land, and he's had a lot of interest in conservation easements for quite a while. So, and I'm interested in the talk because I do conservation easements with the Sycamore Land Trust. So, James, you're on for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I guess this is the first time I've presented here at the Colloquium, so, long-time listener, first-time caller, I suppose. And I can blame Bernie on conservation easements. I was going a very different direction in my doctoral work till I learned about conservation easements, and then that kind of changed everything and has sent me down a trajectory of studying private land conservation. But first I want to acknowledge the co-authors. Actually, the first author on this paper is Tatiana Rasiba. She's at Appalachian State. She studies politics. She went to grad school here at IU and was affiliated with the workshop formerly here and still is. And then Michael Drescher, another associate professor, but he's at the University of Waterloo in the School of Planning. And what's interesting about this is all three of us have been the lead author on this paper at different points in time. And we've been working on it for multiple years, and it gets shifted around to whoever has the energy. And we've all, during this period, we've all been going up for promotion and tenure at the same time. So it's like most of our work is very data-driven, survey-type research or what have you. And then this paper has been, what we've been doing for fun. But just want to point out a few things in my 5 minutes. One is, some main points that we've been wrestling with, trying to draw this linkage between conservation easements and common pool resources, and really thinking about how the two are interconnected because they're not very well discussed, if at all, within the literature. So that was a major point to this paper. Number 2 is trying to apply these design principles to conservation easement regimes or systems in the work of land trust. Most commonly, it has to deal with, more strictly with the commons, if you will, but rarely in discussion with privately held lands and entities that we discuss in the paper, how there are a lot of quasi-common-pool resources that stem from these privately owned and protected lands. And then, for me personally, it's an attempt to translate this important scholarship to hopefully make practical connections and practical applications for professionals. We define a lot of terms in here, but I was looking back and I was like, well, one we didn't really define very well, though it's just sort of inherent, is quasi-common pool resources. I don't know if we actually came up with that term or that's just what we use, but it was essentially there are some potential benefits that are available to a breadth of beneficiaries, while others that are not. Very oversimplification there, but that's essentially how we're using that term. And obviously the landowner retains certain rights and certain benefits that nobody else has access to. So we wrote this paper as more of an insight or a thought piece or an application piece, not as a research article. And it's actually been rejected from a few really, what I consider really important good journals. And one of the critiques that I keep seeing is, well, what were your methods? It's like, well, there weren't methods here because this was more of a thought piece and as opposed to an empirical analysis. And so, I'm hopeful that, and my colleagues are hopeful, hello, they're online, that we get some really good insight coming from the workshop and the colloquium today to help us further this conversation, improve this piece, to actually get it into the literature, to benefit others and for us to get feedback from a broader audience. So we've said this out, like I said, a few times. So one critique is it needs to be empirical. So we maybe it's the fit with the journals, or we've tried to communicate that this is more of a thought piece, but it hasn't worked so far. And the reviewers are often not sure why it matters or is appropriate to apply the design principles to these private land conservation regimes. We would argue that this is an important consideration to be had that really hasn't been discussed to this point. One reviewer noted that there's a danger in examining each of the principles individually, as opposed, they said they need to be taken collectively, which I can understand that, but at the same time in a discussion it is helpful, we found, to look at them on an individual basis and see how they apply. But knowing there's a lot of coupled, there's a coupled nature to many of these, and they're very complex. Some positive feedback we've gotten is this raises awareness around these complex private/public conservation tools and issues, while it also links the analytical insights of the design principles to a public-private conservation instrument. And so I don't know how familiar you are with this, and I can go into more detail on conservation easements and the work of land trust. And most of my work is focused here in the Midwest, and a lot has been done, I've worked on it here in Indiana. So I feel like the goals for today are gain some critical insights from you all on how to revise and improve this piece, not just so we can get a publication out of it, but so we can get it into the literature to help further the conversation on how CPRs, the design principles, and conservation easements are all interrelated. So thinking about, I'm hopeful to learn from you what you feel like after reading the paper, what the biggest deficits, the holes, or the shortcomings of this was, as well as what seems to work for you, and maybe some areas for improvement. And just last comment is, I want to thank Mike McGinnis at midnight last night. He sent me this beautiful, well-crafted feedback because he wasn't able to be here today, and a lot of helpful insights. So thanks to Mike. But happy to take questions and go from here.
Jimmy.
So James, for Lynn, somewhere in the process, it became important to her to distinguish between common pool resources and common property resources. And I think that's what you have in mind. We used to use the term quasi-common pool resources, I think. It was, in my thinking about this, it was never quite as important, but there is an element of, in my mind, the true story about common pool resources, the biggest story is about open access, purely open access.
Yeah.
Okay? And then you've moved down to this world of limited access. But how do you get limited access without somebody starting to claim some boundary conditions, right? But maybe that's not necessarily property. Maybe there's a way in which you start to limit boundary conditions without going as far as it becoming property. So what you have here is legalized property. It's owned by a person, some entity, which could be a group, could be an individual, could be an organization or whatever, but it still seems very much like common property, right? And so I think that's the place I would start with, sort of clarifying this. And then, at least in my mind, I would have liked to know more about how do these land trusts differ in that sense of common property. To what extent do they vary in terms of who has control and amount of control and long-term control and things of that nature. So it's not so much a question,
Response?
I guess. It was a comment.
I'm just taking a note here. No, I think those are really important things, and that to me is the perplexing thing about conservation easements. So we could look at some easements, say that allow people that connect the Appalachian Trail, which is 1,457 miles from Georgia to Maine, and so there's a lot of easements that are connecting these state and federal lands in which people have access to those. But you're right; it's still the land is owned by an individual. However, some of these benefits escape to this greater, to the greater public. Whether and that one, in my knowledge on easements, most commonly it's not like the public gets free range. I mean, that's actually quite to one end of the spectrum. However, there are obviously benefits that just aren't maintained there. But that's an important way to think about it, is that common property resource.
But also, as you start to point out in the paper, what became later on, and this is some of the area I've been working on recently, it has to do with thinking about these ecological systems as providing public goods.
Yeah.
But if they're purely public goods, then you're not dealing in this issue of a appropriating rents, you're dealing with an issue of sort of efficient provision of those public goods, or unless it's degradation of those public goods. So that may be something else you tease out a little more about. Are some of these what you call CE systems, or some of these land trusts, is it more about public good provision, or is it more about sort of containing a resource that would be over appropriated if it were not being held like this? So that becomes a pretty important distinction. Although both of those things can be happening.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I think it's really complicated, which is like, classic response. It's complicated, and both, I see both occurring. I mean, you can point to some in the West that really they've used easements and land trusts have worked to, sort of safeguard against development and block development. To others around that it's really about the provisioning, the long-term provisioning of those ecosystem services. So, I mean, I just saw an announcement the other day where a farm had been protected with an easement for food supply. And it was the first one I ever see written and discussed in that manner. It was about preserving the food supply. I mean, usually it's about the culture of the culture of ag land or the land of an area. Or, big picture, yes, it's about food supply when it comes to ag easements. However, this one was really thinking about the provisioning of sustainable food. So, that was the first one. And then they get really complicated. How do you steward these and monitor them and make sure this is actually occurring? So it's sort of off topic. I know there are more questions.
Lee.
Yeah, well, mine's very similar to Jimmy's. I think you'd be better off, rather than starting with the design principles, giving us a taxonomy about these trusts. Because when I think about common pool resources, generally the issues preventing overuse and exclusion. And you said, well, there's all these different types, so I guess I would start, as Jimmy, I think, was suggesting, with a taxonomy of what kinds of easements are there.
Yeah.
Are some a pure public good because they, they're not excludable? You don't want them to be excludable. Everyone benefits from having this. Because then it's not so clear, many of these design principles are really applicable, which is fine. But some will be. You always want to have boundaries, okay? And, do you want to prevent overuse? Do you, and you have to have enforcement. So I think, but if we have this taxonomy as to what's a public good and what's a common pool resource, I think that would help a lot. At least would help me, because I'm going and reading these design principles going, well, geez, I don't really know enough about all these different types of, there's the Sycamore Land Trust, and there's all these local things around here, and, and is it just a tax write-off for a bunch of guys to, so they can keep their neighbors away? And Boulder did all these things, and just, so rich people can keep living in Boulder and have open space and sock it away. So you've got all these multiple different categories, which I think makes it really fascinating. If you could first come up with a taxonomy and then move to see how these things help or don't help you, and then you'd see how you need to extend the design principles, perhaps, to take into account trusts. Because I think you want to add to the literature, not just take it and plug it in here, because we don't know what the problem is. And so it's similar to what Jimmy's point, I think, was.
I agree.
Frederica wants to follow.
It's just
that.
directly, like in the first page, you say concerns exist that CEs do not offer flexibility in the face of environmental, socioeconomic, and demographic changes shaping resource use on private lands, but you never go back to fleshing out what those concerns are.
Unpacking that.
Right. So I think that might be like one way to plug this in. It also seems to me that the CEs are governance solutions to conservation problems per se, but what you are like really interested in is how they evolve over time in the face of shocks. some of which we can predict and some of which we don't. And I don't think that the application of the design principles leads you to say, well, CEs are quasi-CPRs and they need these things. But that is not really addressing what I think is your key question here, which is how these agreements evolve over time in the face of shocks.
Yeah, the sort of the so what.
Right. Thank you. Sorry.
Jess wants to follow up on this as well. Martin, I'll get to you in a minute. They're lining up.
Sorry,
This line of thinking.
Well, so I had similar questions, but a lot of it had to do with sort of, you talk about how these trusts have stakes, right? They advocate on, they're sort of advocated for. But I'm curious, who is it that cares about this, and does that vary, right? So who are the relevant, who is it that has the highest stakes, and whether conservation easements actually occur in these places or not? And does that actually shape the sort of when the principles apply and not, and how they might apply, right? So so we've got these trusts, and this gets to sort of, I think, Lee's question, sort of taxonomy of these, but thinking specifically about whether that taxonomy reflects a shift in who it is that is advocating for these, and whether that matters on how applicable the principles might be.
Yeah, I think it's very contextually dependent. So I'm going to go with Indiana as an example. There were several. There was a lot of land protection. There's been a lot of land protection going on, I'd say, for the last 20 years through conservation easements, through land trusts, because different money's been thrown into it. In different states, I think there are 4 states that actually have tax credits as opposed to just tax deductions, which has really inspired or motivated a lot of use of easements. And so, it could come down, like, for example, there's a small conservancy or a small land trust on the east side of Indianapolis. I think it's still around. It's called the Mud Creek Conservancy, and it's really a very tiny watershed. It's benefiting the local residents in that area, and one can make the argument it's helping protect the watershed going into the White River throughout Indianapolis and so forth. However, the application or the sort of the benefit of the work that they're doing and those easements that they're protecting in those areas is probably just to those people in that little area. And so you get the people that are on the board that's really supportive of this, and then, local residents that are really supportive of it, and it's not really going beyond that. While Sycamore is the largest, local land trust in the state of Indiana, so it's basically starts up here in Morgan, Brown, Bartholomew counties and goes to the southwestern part of the state, probably include about 21 counties. And so you can see a lot sort of different, I guess, potential impact and potential stakeholders, and particularly because they're not just working with private landowners, they're actually acquiring land and opening it up to the public for recreational opportunities, like the Bean Blossom Bottoms and the work they've done there with several different agencies, to the environmental education that they're doing in the schools, teaching kids about this. So I think, I guess this gets back to some of the earlier comments, is really contextualizing the work that these land trusts are doing and thinking about how I guess it's very dependent upon the situation at hand. I don't know if I've answered your question, but so please re-ask it if I haven't.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's more just sort of, does that shape the kinds of CEs that are negotiated, and is there variance there that you could predict with applying sort of through the application of these principles or not?
Yes, I would say very much so. Because some are more inclined to like protecting agricultural lands, or others are more focused on, more. I don't want to say perfect or old growth or anything like that, but just a little more, lands that have been protected for a longer period of time that have certain ecological qualities to them. And then while some are more willing to just, to protect anything, and they'll take agricultural land and they'll replant it and they'll try to convert it back into deciduous hardwood forest, like the Whitewater Valley Land Trust over in East Central Indiana. So, it just sort of depends on, and a lot of this depends on who the board is and the focus and the goals of the board and how they've developed their strategic plan. And then, we've seen examples where easements are written in the mid-90s that allow certain activities, maybe some sort of gas exploration and extraction, but then new technology comes along and now there's a whole new set of options that are available which weren't considered in this original easement from 20 years ago. So yeah, I mean, it's really complicated, but I think you're right, and that it's you know, there are different priorities being, you know, where these principles can be sort of reconfigured or thought about for each.
Right, but I think that like what Justice is going for is the variation in the CE contracts will tell you something about the applicability of principles
Yeah.
For different uses and for different conglomerates of stakeholders.
Mhm.
So even if you don't want to go the empirical way, I think that this is a contribution in and of itself that is, I mean, to me, I guess, more significant than just saying like this is a quasi-common-pool resource and we can analyze it through these principles. No, these principles are actually telling us something significant about the variation in the contracts themselves.
It might set
Maybe.
you or somebody else to follow up with a particular empirical design that might then
Yeah.
include some of your reviewers, at least in terms of like nodding towards this is how we might think about what the implications are.
How we would actually do this, and yeah.
Good. Mark, let's go with, Martin was second in line, but we kind of moved around, so Mark.
Yeah, thanks James for the nice piece. I really enjoyed reading it. So I've read it more like a theory building paper. I thought it was really interesting. And I think I'm going to touch upon a little bit of the comments that were made before. I think one of the big questions here might be, is it about conservation easements or is it about land trusts? The way I read it is that you seem to be like saying that conservation easements is the mechanism that sort of allow, you know, to connect the gaps between, you know, the resource users, the ones who benefit from the resources. But there's also this discussion about land trust and leadership. And so as I was reading it more in a theory building kind of way, I was surprised you hadn't mentioned the paper from Brandizio, Ostrom, and Young from 2009 about multi-level social-ecological system in Brazil, and you know, the role of social capital. And I thought it would have been interesting maybe to sort of replace your discussion in that context of the mechanisms that sort of help to bridge this kind of multi-level social-ecological issues, to be more clear about what kind of mechanism you're really pinning down here, between just conservation easement, which can take very different forms and sort of, you know, depending on how you frame the contract.
Yeah.
And the actual role of land trust as being like a social player that actually helps to do all the leadership you need for, you know, getting things done, and, you know, how that differ from the role of the community there, you know, in other cases. Or so I thought the main contribution of your piece could have been, and could still be, sort of like land trust as one of the ways, you know, social capital can actually do something.
Well, I don't have a good excuse on that Brandizio piece, except for one of my co-authors was supposed to do it, and they didn't know. They're not here to defend themselves, but thank you for that, and I want to go back and take a look very much. You know, I think that's a really interesting observation, and it's one that one of our reviewers had commented on, like, okay, what's this paper really about? And I mean, the fact of the matter is, you can't, like, we took it from the perspective, because we could, easements can be held by, you know, state government, for example, or, you know, but we wanted to focus on land trusts and these non-governmental institutions. And you can't have one without the other, in most part. I mean, most land trusts deal with conservation easements. Now, there are a handful that don't. They just own land in fee simple, and that's all that they deal with. And so, then, in essence, it really is a, you know, common pool resource, because it is, you know, those privately owned boundaries are not quite as there. But, you know, you all might argue differently. But I think they both have to be discussed, and, you know, in here together. And maybe the point is that this needs to be a broader, bigger, more robust discussion that takes place over a couple of papers, if you will. But thinking about the taxonomy of land trusts, for one, is also this taxonomy for easements being another, because they're obviously not the same. And so I think if you ask each of the different authors on this, we're going to have a different response for you. For me personally, it was about conservation easements. And that's what the focus of the paper was. But I don't want to speak for Tatiana or Michael, so maybe it was one for them. It was really about bringing this land trust conversation out. However, our work and the application of the pieces, as you well point out, sometimes it goes to land trust and the principles, we're applying them to land trust situations, and sometimes we're applying them to easements. And so I can understand how that is confusing to the reader. And it's like, okay, focus on one or the other, but or frame it in a way that makes more sense. So
Yeah, not necessarily choosing between the two, but at least, I think the taxonomy of land trust or easements could be useful in that sense to clarify.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great suggestion. Thanks.
Landon.
Well, I think it's obviously an important piece, and I like the topic a lot. I guess I would echo a number of other comments, perhaps especially Jessica's and Denise to some extent. That I think one of the things that I think is interesting that you guys aren't really dealing with, at least currently, is that land trusts are essentially trying to create a common property system on top of a private property system. So that really contrasts a lot of at least the canonical CPR studies, because those are looking at, we don't have a private property system, we have a common property system, and there are bits of private property that are nested within that. I think that might be a more compelling framing. I don't know if it's necessarily good advice, but it's I think something to think about, because I think it does speak to some of these issues of variation in that, what do landowners see as the appropriation and the provisioning in practical terms? Is that similar or different from what the land trusts see? Because I think the problem that I expect that you guys would characterize is that private property regimes are under-providing some of the biodiversity benefits, wildlife habitat benefits, and to some extent are not restricting things that cause like water quality impairment or sort of other aspects. So I think that would be an interesting aspect to look at, because you have these very interesting property regime dynamics that are interacting, and so what's the tension there in terms of our land trusts helping and owners think about their responsibilities in a new way? I mean, is that one of the effects of the interaction? To what extent? Or does it, to Lee's point about what's going on in Boulder, is it really, just, the provisioning is aesthetic and recreational value to people who have lots of money?
Building on top of that, like the last points you were making, I think when these properties transfer to the second generation of owners, because for all intents and purposes, the lands that have been eased in the last 20 or 30 years are still either owned by the original easement donor or seller, or maybe somebody in the family. But we're starting to see this transfer out of family and out of that generation. Mm-hmm. So I think you're going to get a whole different set of answers to those questions you're posing as this new group of owners takes over. Because I think in rural areas, perhaps somebody might be able to correct me, but on average, property transfers every 15 years or so. And these people are obviously committed to these properties in a lot of cases, and so they've put these easements on them. But now we're seeing the second generation buy them and not really informing themselves over what a conservation easement is and what it actually means in real world experience of owning land. So no, I think that's a really interesting question, and thanks for the suggestion.
Yeah, gosh, now I see the comment that I'm going to make cross-cuts a number of things, a number of points that have already been made, because it's really basic and it deals with fundamentals, which is why I really, really like this paper. I'd like to see it get published in some form at some point. But I have a concern that this notion of conservation easements as a category is not a singular thing, as you know. And I'm just wondering that the nature of the legal restrictions may actually alter the degree to which the design principles might apply to them. You probably have a taxonomy of easements that you need to contend with as well. So you're beginning to cut it much more finely here. And in particular, I was thinking that you made a comment that sort of got me thinking about this. I think it's on the fourth page, other than I'm numbered, so it's hard to tell. It's the fourth one in. The presence of all principles is neither necessary nor sufficient for successful CPR management, and it goes on and on. It's a pretty good point, but it sort of begs the question: to what extent can you violate the design principles and still have applicability? In other words, is there a certain core set of design principles that you must adhere to for successful management of these entities, or are there some that are more peripheral that you can actually sort of do without? It sort of limits the notion of a taxonomic approach to understanding the phenomenon of interest, unless you want to cut it much more finely. I'm not sure how to deal with that. The way you guys have dealt with it is to say, well, however, in given complex in certain environments, we believe adherence to the design principle may help ensure sustainability. The question remains unanswered. Which ones can you give up and still have a successful regime? I don't know. And then with respect to the last couple of comments, as a matter of public policy, I wondered, should a single owner at a single point in time have the right to permanently impair or encumber the use value of a parcel of land? And I wondered the extent to which a governmental entity can still condemn the property by eminent domain and take it. Which sort of opens the door to the relative permanence of any of these regimes in the long run, based upon, I don't know, public fancy, public preferences. Things change. So in the end, aren't we really talking about, a battle for the hearts and minds of people to believe that easements and maintaining the integrity of environmental space ought to be sustained. I don't know. It touches on so many things. It's easy to start wandering off of your main point because it's really fundamental, which once again I will say is why I like it.
It's funny, sometimes tongue-in-cheek when I'm presenting at conferences, I'll say, easements are good in perpetuity, or as long as the court said they are, because I think you bring up a really valid point to the longevity or potentially the lack thereof. But, to my knowledge, which I will readily admit is limited, and my understanding of all of Lynn's work, or even a little bit of Lynn's work, but I don't know of a certain formula of okay, you need to have X number of principles, and then it sort of fits, or if you don't have this many, then it doesn't. To us, theoretically, it fit. Even though some are more challenging, the applicability was a bit more challenging than others, and how it's actually carried out in the real world. And that's really what we're basing these, our discussion on. We went back and we interviewed a handful of land trusts on monitoring and violations and things that they had to deal with, because it was really sort of, we were wanting to see how these things actually manifest on the ground in real time, and that's why, when it comes to the monitoring, which I think is probably, those of you scholars have been here for a long time, I'm guessing it's a pretty important one. But some of the monitoring, talk to people, and they're like, oh, we do a drive-by. I'm like, yeah, but you're talking about 400 acres. It's like, how well are you monitoring that if it's a drive-by or a telephone call? Yeah, some are doing aerial stuff, aerial work, where some states are actually, aerial photography happens every other year, and half the state one year, half the state another, which is, it's pretty good. But some people are like, oh, we just check in via the phone and to see if, but then it's like, how well is that monitoring stipulation actually occurring? And so, it gets back to your question, is which of these do we actually need? And I don't have a great answer for you, but I think that's something that needs to be discussed on, do the design principles fit if we just have a handful? And I would like to phone a friend of you that, but yes, Lee, if you got some ideas, please.
Well, I think you kind of, you're again starting with the design principles, where we want to say, well, what's the objective function when you've got a trust or an easement? What's the purpose? Are you just trying to allow people access, egress to the entrance to the Appalachian Trail? Okay, then we can say, okay, how do you do that? What's the best way to do that? How important are these principles? So it seems to me that you've got so many, till we know what it is, again, what's the objective function? What are you trying to manage? And right now it's just so diffuse, I think. So I think a lot of these principles are important for about anything.
Yeah.
Not just common pool, they're important for private markets. You got to define your good, you got to protect it, you got to monitor sanctions. So these work for private markets as well. So at some point, I think again, if we would start with, there's probably an infinite variety of these things, but if you can put them into certain boxes, we can then better decide, okay, the real objective function here is X. Then we can see how well these things fit. And here, the real objective function, as you said, is preserving farming. That's a whole different deal. And so I think you seem to be trying to put the cart in front of the horse in that sense, where we need to know the objective function associated with these different easements and trusts, where I actually think this is really important and hasn't been taken on, and I think it really needs to be a larger piece of work, not a paper, because I think this is pretty big.
You don't want to hear that.
I know, you never want to hear that.
Brian, it
but-
just took me 4 years to write a book. I don't want to do that again the same way.
I'm on my 10th year for a book, but no, I'm just saying I think it's really important, and you got to dive into this thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's really complicated. I mean,
Yeah, that's what I mean.
particularly like if we get it, there's major differences in types of land trust, from like the Mud Creek Conservancy, which is really small, like I told you about, to the Nature Conservancy, being the
Right.
world's largest, and then to the types of easements, anywhere, and they're very different, for ecological or cultural reasons, and some interesting easements that were placed on private lands along the Blue Ridge Parkway, so that there would be no harvesting of timber along there, because they're trying to protect the aesthetic beauty,
Yeah.
which is great. However, nobody can view anything along the parts of the Blue Ridge Parkway right now, because at this point in time, because all the trees grew up, and so the idea was to have this scenic vista, but you've in a sense tied it all up because you can't manage those trees, which is kind of ironic at the same time. It's not the entire Blue Ridge Parkway, but it's part of it. It's just discussions and conversations that we've had. To me it's entirely complicated as we move from east to west and what have you, and size and scale.
I mean, the other alternative would be to start small. Just take on Indiana.
Yeah, which arguably, if you go from down here in the south to the
Yeah,
more
I
the
mean, even
agricultural
that's
lands of the
too, well,
north,
but take on a
to the
size
wetlands
that's
up there.
manageable.
Yeah,
It's all within one state law.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And Bernie's point's, at least you've got consistency in state law. You're holding something constant,
mm-hmm.
and because otherwise, as you said, if you go from east to west, there's the number of variations of these things is so large.
Yes. Yeah.
All right, so I've got Jess, Martin, and Jimmy lined up, and Phil. Okay.
So I want to go back to something earlier that came up about sort of the question of longitudinal change, right? The fact that
Sorry, just
the question of longitudinal,
Okay,
this
yeah.
sort of what is it that is changing here? And this sort of actually came up for me as I was reading this, in part because you mentioned sort of adaptability a few times, and I was curious. And then just briefly in a comment earlier today, you said something about how new owners are not getting the information they should about what the conservation easement is actually doing or should be doing. So I guess my question is two-part. A, how interested are you in the sort of longitudinal dimension here? Is that fundamentally what you care about? And if so, what is it that is changing here? Is it a lack of information between generations of owners, right? Or is it an actual change in preferences? And can we is it either one or the other? Is it both? Is there an understanding as to whether one is more likely to have a robust sort of the conservation easement outcome is likely to be more robust on one set of changes as opposed to the other? And does that then again sort of change the way you think about the principles being applied? Does that make sense? So in other words, is the longitudinal dimension particularly unique in the context of conservation easements, right? Is this a broader common-pool resource problem than you could sort of apply here? But more specifically, I think you can answer that question with what is it that you think is most important about the longitudinal change that is occurring? Is it information? Is it preferences? Is it both? Does that vary?
My hypothesis going into studying that longitudinal difference would be it's like the lack of knowledge
Okay.
and communication that's going on, because particularly when it transfers out of family, it seems like in the research that I've done and that we've done, I've done with these other with my co-authors, and talking and interviewing a lot of people that have placed easements, like this has been part of a family conversation, and so people are pretty well aware of it. Now you might have some people that are really disturbed about it, and some children that did not want the land tied up in this way because they may have had other sort of plans for the land that would be more financially rewarding to themselves. However, it's part of a conversation. But then, I mean, we talked to a handful of folks in some northern states, and they're even partnering with realtors in areas where there's a high number of conservation easements to educate the realtors on what this actually means to home buyers and to land buyers. Because like people are selling this land, and they're like, if you bought a house or a piece of land, you realize that there are going to be electric easements and water easements and all sorts of easements like that. I mean, we don't even have road frontage at our place. We have an easement that goes through a neighbor's property, so you might not think anything about it. However, what they're doing is trying to hyper-educate potential home buyers in the realtor community about these issues. So that, if I was to hypothesize, that's an area that I would really pursue, is this out-of-family land transfer and the issues that arise from that, and how that complicates sort of the monitoring and the and making sure that easement is adhered to over the long term. Because and the little bit of the literature that exists on this, because it's been only recently where you've been able to get data on these second generation owners, is that's where the problems are occurring.
Yeah, that was super interesting.
Yeah, and there's only been just a handful of papers come out, because it's really just been in the last, I'd say, 8 or so years that you're getting enough of these second generation landowners to actually show up on the radar.
It seems like you do something super interesting with the theory there.
Yeah, there's some great scholars down in Texas. I think they're in Texas is where all the research is coming out of. But they're doing a lot of work, because there's a lot of easements put on, in a couple of regions down in Texas. No, so it's really an emerging conversation. While some people would say it's a very niche as far as private land conservation, I would say, well, yes, it might be niche, but it's important, to keep further along in the conversation. Important.
I had a question that I think just made it far more interesting than what I'm going to ask. Well, it's more a suggestion maybe. But yeah, like the longitudinal dimension seems to me one of the most interesting in order to make your argument about the sort of conservation easements as the best way to ensure sustainability. And so I'm wondering whether you couldn't, even with anecdotal evidence, sort of describe the time evolution of the institutional arrangements around land trust and conservation easements. Because one thing that fascinated me recently with the story of the Nature Conservancy was their shift in strategy from just purely buying private land and funding every conservation activities on it to actually giving back the land to some local land trusts, some local NGOs who will actually manage this kind of conservation easements, and rather being the actor that creates a community of scientists, local public officials and local ranchers, landowners, farmers to actually take care of that kind of conservation challenge over the long term. So I'm thinking couldn't you sort of reshift your study around how have these conservation easements and land trust evolve over time in the way they operate and the way they link with the community, in order to show that you have sort of the best institutional story behind that, the natural evolution of those institutions converge toward this kind of form, which is believed to be, more sustainable in the future.
I think you bring up a really good point that I don't think would be complicated or hard. I mean, like I just know personal examples and working with the local community around here. Where, you got the former Girl Scout camp at Belmont that was, the Nature Conservancy bought because they could do it quickly to keep it from being developed, and then they're turning around and selling it to the state forest over time to to the DNR, and so they're able to facilitate those transactions. I mean, it's just a pretty simple one that I know through my teaching, through the classes I teach, but there are plenty out there like that. So no, there's a lot of great examples that we can look at. Thanks.
All right, Jimmy, and then Phil, and then Scott.
So James, I actually think, unlike a lot of colloquium, you're hearing sort of a lot of the same ideas over and over again. And so I have one idea, short of writing a book.
I appreciate it.
So this term, the good, the bad, and ugly, often comes up, and somehow you need to let the editors know that you're really adding something new here, and you need to let the reader have a sense of what do you see as the issues. So I think you need some examples pretty early on about some case examples. This is when things are going right, and these are ones in which things are going to hell in a handbasket. And that starts to give the reader some sense of what you're interested in. Okay? Without it, those of us that don't teach this stuff that are involved in it, it's a little hard to parse this out. I think actually it's the second paragraph, when you start to define the CE and you go into some of the issues. I think that's pretty much all you say about these issues in a way, and you somehow need to get the reader to realize this taxonomy comes back to both the types of easements and trusts, but also what are the problems within those. And then you start to give the reader a sense of these are important issues and how they break down over time and how they're changing over time. And then you're going to start to have an editor that feels like, yeah, you're really adding something that's important. In that sense. So.
The thing about this, I completely agree, and this is, when we've tried to publish this, I think the first journal we sent it to was Conservation Biology, and the second was Ecology and Society, and with these types of pieces, I think they wanted like 4,500 words or 5,000 words, but it's really a poor fit on our poor fit choice by us, knowing we need to go for a different journal, and that's probably because Tatiana and Michael and I have, that's where we've done a lot of our publishing for conservation easement or PLC research, and so that's where we just sort of felt like the home was. But maybe realizing that maybe that's part of the problem is we're not choosing the right home, which doesn't allow us to explore this and in a broader, deeper capacity. So, yeah, because you're right. Because and this gets back to one of Federica's comments earlier. Like we make this pretty important comment, but we don't ever unpack it. And and we with more space we can go into that. Yeah.
Bill.
Yeah, and this is just kind of another angle on it, which I think just builds on the previous good comments. And that is that I'm wondering if we have a sense of failure about these things, and that the principles might reveal themselves, might be zero signs in the sense that they reveal themselves by virtue of their absence rather than their presence. So you're taking kind of a residual approach to understand what's going on by studying the failures rather than the successes. And that suggests an area of empirical research as well as kind of a methodology for this work that complements maybe the research that's already going on.
And what's interesting about your observation is that was never an intentional, deliberate decision that my co-authors and I made. It was just by happenstance that's how it unfolded. But I think it's a very helpful suggestion.
Scott.
This builds off the last two comments, and in some ways your hands are tied by the journal, obviously the journalists and everything, so take this with a grain of salt. But you mentioned the multi-level governance literature, polycentric governance, on page 9.
Yeah.
And you kind of want to do it in passing, and you kind of reference some things like, there's some international linkages that could be interesting to explore, like the American Friends of Canadian Land Trusts. And kind of to your point on successful and kind of failure stories in this vein, I was curious, it may be in a follow-up piece, but if you're interested or maybe you've already done work in looking at some of these comparative trusts to see what we can learn, whether it's Texas or otherwise, from how other regions have explored and some of these governance issues.
So I'll be partly honest. When we revised this one time, that one of the things that you need to talk about this for more, try to broaden out and discuss the international. So that in some ways was a nod, if you will, because I think it's really, and there are a handful of others in here because it's really complicated because this is very much dependent upon types of property ownership, which is very different from country to country, and then the land trust is set up, and they're very different. It's part of the easement program is part of the Farm Bill, and so it's. I find it very difficult to extrapolate to other countries or just to do comparisons. Canada would probably be the one with the easiest direct comparison because in Ontario there's some similar programs. So and that's why what brought honestly Michael Drescher and I, we started working together a handful of years ago, was because of that, the parallels between Indiana and Ontario, to be honest. So I think that that would be. We need to do more of. We were just basically trying to help each other and get advice from each other, but we never actually truly compared them, across those borders. And I think that's very valid. So, yes. I don't know if I answered any of your questions, but
No, it's helpful. Worth exploring.
So let me add a kind of a real world example of this kind of paper with some of this input could be helpful to. State of Minnesota, a lot of public land, active land trusts, and their goal generally is to acquire easements or land and eventually transfer it to the state. The whole goal is the state's the best place, a huge natural resource agency, very powerful, so they'll do the right thing. Bill in the legislature this year that almost passed, and the suggestion is it will pass next year. No net gain of public land. It's an interesting bill in Minnesota.
Because they have a state land trust, the Minnesota land trust.
And so the state is, everybody got nervous and said, we've got to find another mechanism to protect these lands we want to protect. And the real issue is there's a timber company that's got in the range of 200,000 acres of land across the state, and it's all for sale. Deer hunters and whatever are up in arms, and they're raising money to acquire the land to get it to the state. And all of a sudden someone's saying, not going to happen anymore. And so thinking of where else it would go, what legalese would protect it and everything, it's an interesting discussion up there. The gist is very active right now. They're trying to figure out what to do. And the whole thing is the counties have fought and said we don't want any more land off the tax rolls, and so it's keeping land on the tax rolls, which means probably conservation easements. Anything else that would go to the cause? Thank you. Good discussion, everybody.
Thank you very much for your help and your questions.
We help it along.